Somewhere beneath the streets of Rome, behind walls thick enough to stop an artillery shell, guarded by men in Renaissance uniforms carrying genuinely modern weapons, sits one of the strangest libraries on the planet. 53 miles of shelving, something like 35,000 separate volumes just to catalog what's inside. Over 1,200 years of documents, written in ink, in wax seals, and in more than a few cases, in blood. For most of the 20th century, the world knew this place by a name that practically guaranteed it would become the stuff of legend, the Vatican's secret archives. The rumors have never really stopped. Some people insist it holds a hidden, more accurate timeline of the life of Jesus. Others swear it contains proof of contact with extraterrestrial life, artifacts looted during the Crusades, or a sealed set of prophecies detailing exactly how the world ends. The actual truth turns out to be less like science fiction and considerably more disturbing, because it isn't about aliens or apocalypse prophecy at all. It's about what happens when the most enduring institution on Earth gets to decide, entirely on its own terms, exactly which parts of its own history the rest of us are allowed to know. Because while the Vatican has spent the last century and a half slowly, selectively opening certain doors to a carefully vetted handful of scholars, there remain entire chapters of documented human suffering that the Church has fought, for decades or even centuries, to keep sealed away in the dark. Today we're going past the guarded gates, past the bulletproof reading room glass, and into exactly what's been buried down there. The stolen legacies, the calculated silences, and the bloody truths the Vatican has spent centuries trying to keep out of the history books. If uncovering the parts of history institutions would rather you never find is exactly your kind of rabbit hole, hit subscribe, because that's what we do here at ChronoSphere Academy. Let's start with how this vault actually works, because the system itself tells you almost everything you need to know about how carefully this secrecy has been engineered. ##. You cannot simply walk into the Vatican Apostolic Archive and browse the shelves the way you might wander through a public library back home. There's no open stacks. There's no casual search function anyone outside the institution can access freely. If you happen to be a credentialed historian and you manage to pass a rigorous vetting process, you're eventually permitted to sit in a specific, closely monitored reading room. But there's a catch built directly into the system, and it's a remarkably elegant one if your actual goal is controlling information rather than sharing it. You have to already know precisely what you're looking for. You submit a request for a specific document, identified by its exact catalog reference, and archivists retrieve it for you. If you don't already know the exact name, date, or index number of the secret you're hoping to uncover, you have almost no realistic way of stumbling onto it. There's no browsing your way into an accidental discovery. It is, in effect, one of the most sophisticated systems of institutional gatekeeping ever constructed. Not through outright denial, but through a structure that makes it functionally impossible to find what you don't already know exists. For centuries, that airtight secrecy did exactly what you'd expect it to do. It fed a constant, swirling undercurrent of speculation and conspiracy about what might be hidden inside. So in 1881, Pope Leo XII made a move that, viewed with modern eyes, looks like a remarkably savvy piece of public relations strategy. He opened a carefully chosen slice of the archive to outside researchers for the first time in the institution's history. It was, in effect, the Vatican's way of announcing to the world, "Look, we have nothing to hide." It was also, in an important sense, an illusion. The documents released under this new openness were genuinely extraordinary pieces of history. A desperate letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written as she begged the Pope to intervene and spare her life in the days before her execution. The formal decree excommunicating Martin Luther, setting in motion centuries of religious upheaval across Europe. A petition sent by the English Parliament demanding the annulment of King Henry VIII's marriage, carrying the wax seals of 85 separate English lords. These are priceless historical treasures, genuinely fascinating windows into pivotal moments of Western history. They are also, crucially, safe. Every person involved has been dead for centuries. Nobody living today has their reputation on the line. Nobody currently holding institutional power is implicated by anything in these documents. What the Vatican kept locked away, carefully, deliberately, and for far longer, were the documents connected to something considerably more dangerous: proof of the institution's own involvement in systematic persecution, calculated political maneuvering, and cover-ups reaching well into the modern era. Chapters of history where the people implicated, or their direct institutional descendants, are still very much alive, or still very much in power. To understand exactly how far the Church has been willing to go to protect its own image, we have to go back over 700 years, to one of the most brutal betrayals in medieval history. On Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307, soldiers across the entirety of France carried out one of the most coordinated mass arrests in medieval history. Their target, the Knights Templar, the fabulously wealthy, deeply secretive military order that had spent nearly 2 centuries protecting pilgrims during the Crusades and, in the process, building what amounted to one of the first international banking networks in European history. The arrested Templars were subjected to brutal torture. Many were eventually burned at the stake. The charges leveled against them read like a checklist of medieval nightmares: heresy, secret idol worship, spitting on the cross during clandestine initiation rituals. For roughly 700 years, the official historical record told a fairly consistent story. Pope Clement V, the head of the Church at the time, simply abandoned the Templars to their fate, allowing King Philip I of France to destroy the order without meaningful resistance. The Vatican's own position, repeated across centuries, was that the Templars had genuinely been guilty of heresy, and that the Church's silence in the face of their destruction was, at worst, a regrettable failure to intervene. The Vatican archives, it turns out, told an entirely different story, one they simply chose not to tell anyone for the better part of 7 centuries. In 2001, a researcher named Barbara Frail was working through the archive's holdings when she came across a document that had apparently been misfiled decades or centuries earlier, tucked away in the wrong section entirely. It became known as the Chinon Parchment. This single document contained the actual, original transcripts from a secret set of hearings conducted with the Templar leadership. And what it revealed was extraordinary. Pope Clement V had, in private, absolved the Knights Templar of the charges of heresy before their execution. He had personally reviewed the situation and concluded that the confessions extracted from Templar leaders had come through torture, and that the underlying heresy charges themselves didn't hold up. The Pope knew, with a fair degree of certainty, that the men being condemned were very likely innocent of the specific crime they were being executed for, and he let them burn anyway. Why? Because openly contradicting King Philip IV of France, at a moment when the French crown held enormous political and even physical leverage over the papacy itself, would have meant risking Clement's own position and possibly his life. Protecting the Templars' reputation would have meant directly confronting one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. Protecting his own political survival, on the other hand, simply required staying quiet and letting history record the Templars as heretics who deserved exactly what happened to them. The evidence of their innocence sat, quietly, in the Vatican's own basement for roughly 700 years, while an entire order's reputation was left to rot in popular memory as devil-worshipping conspirators. It took an accidental filing error, discovered by one determined researcher, to finally correct a 7-century-old lie the Church had never volunteered to fix on its own. If the Vatican was capable of sitting on evidence this significant for 700 years, purely to protect the political legacy of a single 14th-century pope, it raises an uncomfortable and obvious question. What exactly might they still be sitting on from a century considerably closer to our own? Before we jump forward to the 20th century, there's another case buried in these archives worth understanding, because it shows the same institutional instinct at work over an almost unbelievably long stretch of time. Not 700 years this time, but nearly 400. In 1633, the astronomer Galileo Galilei stood before the Roman Inquisition, forced to answer for his open, published support of the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun rather than the other way around. The trial records, along with his eventual forced recantation, were sealed away within the Church's archival system, treated for centuries as a genuinely embarrassing chapter the institution had little interest in revisiting. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy, forced to publicly renounce his own scientific conclusions under threat of severe punishment, and spent the remainder of his life confined to house arrest. Legend holds that as he rose from his knees after formally recanting, he muttered under his breath, and yet it moves. A quiet act of defiance from a man who knew perfectly well he was right, even as the most powerful religious institution in Europe forced him to publicly say otherwise. For the next several centuries, the Church's position on the matter shifted with what can only be described as glacial reluctance. Galileo's book remained on the Church's official index of forbidden books for roughly 200 years after his death. It wasn't until 1992, nearly 360 years after the original trial, that Pope John Paul II formally issued an expression of regret regarding how the Galileo affair had been handled, effectively acknowledging, at long last, that the Church's own scientific and theological judgment had been catastrophically wrong. Consider the sheer scale of that timeline. An institution capable of holding a position, defending it, and refusing to substantially revisit it for 3.5 centuries is an institution built with an extraordinarily different relationship to time than virtually any other organization on Earth. Governments rise and fall in a fraction of that span. Entire scientific paradigms are born, dominate, and get overturned multiple times over within it. That same patience. The willingness to simply wait out criticism across multiple human lifetimes rather than confront it directly is precisely the same institutional muscle we see flexed again and again throughout the archive's history, whether the subject is a medieval military order, a Renaissance astronomer, or, as we're about to see, a considerably more recent and considerably bloodier financial scandal. Not every secret connected to the Vatican's modern history stays confined to paper. Some of them end up, quite literally, hanging from a bridge. In June of 1982, the body of an Italian banker named Roberto Cavi was discovered dangling from scaffolding beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets deliberately weighted down with bricks and a substantial sum of cash. Cavi had earned a striking nickname in financial circles during his lifetime, God's Banker, a reference to his position as chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, an Italian bank with deep, long-standing financial ties to the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. In the months before his death, Banco Ambrosiano had collapsed catastrophically, revealing a financial hole of somewhere around $1.5 billion, an almost unfathomable sum for the era. Much of it apparently funneled through a complex web of shell companies with direct connections to the Vatican Bank itself. Investigators would later uncover suspected links between the scandal and organized crime networks, secretive political lodges operating outside normal government oversight, and a pattern of financial maneuvering that stretched from Rome to Latin America and back. Italian authorities initially ruled Cavi's death a suicide. Few people close to the case ever genuinely believed that conclusion. The physical evidence at the scene, combined with Cavi's own increasingly desperate and fearful communications in the weeks before his death, painted a considerably darker picture. In 2002, forensic experts re-examining the case concluded that the physical circumstances of his death were essentially inconsistent with suicide, and Italian prosecutors eventually pursued a murder trial against several individuals with alleged organized crime connections, though the case ultimately ended without any convictions actually standing. The Vatican Bank's role throughout the entire scandal has never been fully, transparently accounted for in the way outside investigators and journalists have repeatedly demanded. The specific internal financial records connected to this era, records that could potentially clarify exactly how deeply Vatican financial officials were involved in the underlying scheme, remain among the materials still shielded by the archive's strict access rules, tangled in a mixture of the standard 75-year waiting period and the Vatican Bank's own separate, notoriously opaque tradition of financial secrecy. It's worth sitting, for a moment, with just how far this pattern extends. We've now traced the same fundamental instinct. Protect the institution first. Resolve the moral reckoning only when it's safely inconvenient for no one still living. Across a medieval military order burned at the stake, a Renaissance scientist forced to his knees, a genocide the world begged for answers about for 75 years, and a banker who ended up dead under a London bridge with bricks in his pockets. 4 completely different centuries. 4 completely different kinds of victims. The same underlying institutional reflex, running quietly beneath all of it. This brings us to the single most controversial, most fiercely contested chapter buried within the Vatican's modern archival holdings: the era surrounding the Second World War, and the deeply uncomfortable question of what Pope Pius XI actually knew about the Holocaust, and when he knew it. For decades, historians, survivors, and Jewish advocacy organizations have pressed the Vatican for a full accounting of Pius XI's conduct during the war. His public silence during the years when millions of Jewish people were being systematically murdered across Nazi-occupied Europe has earned him, in the eyes of many critics, a grim and lasting nickname: Hitler's Pope. The Vatican's official defense, repeated for generations, insisted that Pius XI had actually worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using quiet diplomatic channels and networks of monasteries and convents to shelter and save Jewish refugees, all while maintaining public neutrality specifically to avoid provoking even harsher Nazi reprisals against Catholic institutions and the Jewish communities they were sheltering. It's a defense that, on its face, isn't implausible. Quiet, behind-closed-doors diplomacy has genuinely saved lives in other historical contexts. But for that defense to be more than simply a comforting story the Church told about itself, historians needed direct access to the actual internal documentation from that period. For years, the Vatican resisted, citing the sheer scale of the cataloging effort required to responsibly open millions of individual pages to outside researchers. The pressure from historians, from Jewish organizations, and increasingly from the broader public continued mounting for decades. Then, in March of 2020, Pope Francis made a genuinely historic decision. He ordered the full unsealing of the Pius XI-era archives, opening the doors that had remained closed for the better part of 80 years. Historians from around the world converged on Rome almost immediately. Many expected, or at least hoped, to find documentation supporting the long-standing official narrative. Evidence of a quietly heroic pope orchestrating a covert, sophisticated resistance network. What they found instead was considerably more troubling. Brown University historian David Kurtzer spent months painstakingly working through the newly available documents, and his findings landed like a direct challenge to the Vatican's carefully maintained defense. The archives revealed that Pius XI had been receiving detailed, credible, and increasingly undeniable reports about the mass extermination of Jewish people as early as 1942. Reports that included specific, horrifying details about gas chambers, mass shootings, and organized deportations, coming directly from his own trusted advisors and diplomatic contacts across occupied Europe. Perhaps even more damning, when the United States government formally approached the Vatican requesting a direct, public condemnation of the atrocities being reported, Pius XI's own inner circle of advisors counseled him to decline. Their stated reasoning, preserved in the archival record, was almost breathtaking in its callousness. They believed the sources reporting on the scale of the killings, many of them Jewish organizations and refugees, were likely exaggerating the severity of what was actually happening. The documents reveal something even darker in the years immediately following the war's end. Rather than simply staying neutral, elements within the Vatican actively assisted a number of former Nazi collaborators in escaping justice altogether, helping some of them flee prosecution and disappear into new lives in South America and elsewhere. The stated internal justification, preserved in Vatican correspondence from the period, framed the emerging threat of Soviet communism as a more urgent danger to the Church than the already defeated ideology of fascism. A calculation that effectively placed strategic anti-communism above accountability for wartime atrocities. The Vatican held onto these specific documents for 75 years. For 75 years, they controlled precisely which version of Pius XI's wartime legacy the public was allowed to construct, absent any ability to check that narrative against the primary source material itself. And even now, with these archives technically open, historians who have continued digging through them report something unsettling. Certain specific files remain mysteriously unavailable. Some appear to have been redacted. Others seem to simply be missing from where the catalog indicates they should be, which raises the obvious, uncomfortable question hovering over this entire chapter. If this much was hidden about a period the Vatican eventually agreed to open, what does that suggest about the material connected to events even more recent than World War I? Material the institution hasn't yet been pressured into releasing at all? #? There's a formal policy governing exactly when material inside the Vatican archives becomes available to researchers and the public, and understanding it explains an enormous amount about what remains hidden right now, in the present day. The rule states that no document can be made available for public research until 75 years after the death of the reigning pope under whose papacy it was created. It sounds, on its surface, like a reasonably standard archival practice, similar in spirit to declassification timelines used by governments around the world. In practice, this single rule means that vast stretches of extremely recent history remain entirely, legally sealed. Documents connected to the tensions and maneuvering of the Cold War era. The internal correspondence surrounding the notorious Vatican bank financial scandals of the 1980s, which involved allegations ranging from money laundering to mysterious deaths connected to organized crime. Records touching on numerous institutional crises that have rocked the Church within recent living memory. All of it currently sits behind a legally mandated wall of silence, with no guarantee of exactly when, or whether, any given file will eventually see daylight. But there is one archive within the Vatican's vast holdings that operates by an entirely different set of rules. One so tightly controlled that even senior church officials rarely discuss its contents openly. It doesn't answer to the standard 75-year rule at all. It exists, in a very real sense, outside the normal flow of archival time altogether. It's called the Apostolic Penitentiary. The Apostolic Penitentiary functions as the Vatican's internal tribunal for what Catholic doctrine considers the most severe categories of sin. Offenses so grave that an ordinary parish priest lacks the authority to grant absolution for them at all. This includes things like the deliberate desecration of consecrated communion elements, a priest violating the sacred seal of confession by revealing what was confided to them, and other categories of deeply serious, sometimes systemic misconduct occurring within the Church's own ranks. For more than 800 years, this tribunal has maintained meticulous, detailed internal records of these extreme cases. A continuous, unbroken written record of some of the most severe transgressions committed by clergy and church officials across nearly a millennium of institutional history, handled entirely through internal church processes, almost always kept completely separate from secular law enforcement and civil courts. Unlike every other section of the Vatican archives, this particular collection is never open to public research. Not after the standard 75-year waiting period. Not after a century. Historically, not ever, regardless of how much time passes or how many popes come and go in the intervening years. While millions of tourists each year stand beneath the towering dome of St. Peter's Basilica, craning their necks to admire Michelangelo's ceiling and marveling at centuries of religious art and architecture, a permanently sealed ledger of the Church's most severe internal failures sits quietly in the archives beneath their feet. A written record of exactly how an institution this old and this powerful has historically chosen to manage its own darkest chapters, entirely on its own terms, indefinitely. Step back and look at the full shape of what we've just walked through, and a single, uncomfortable pattern emerges clearly enough to tie the whole story together. The Vatican Apostolic Archive isn't simply a library preserving the past for posterity's sake. It functions, in very practical terms, as an instrument of geopolitical and institutional power. One that has been wielded, deliberately and repeatedly, across roughly 8 centuries of documented use. From the quiet betrayal of the Knights Templar, sacrificed to protect one medieval pope's political survival, to the decades-long institutional silence surrounding PSG's wartime conduct, the archive tells us something that applies far beyond the specific walls of Vatican City. History is rarely simply written by the victors in the old, familiar phrase. More precisely, and more uncomfortably, history is written and rewritten by whoever ends up holding permanent, unchallenged control over the primary documents themselves. The Catholic Church has outlasted Roman emperors, medieval kingdoms, and 20th century dictatorships, in no small part because it has proven itself extraordinarily skilled, across many centuries, at carefully curating exactly what portions of its own history the outside world is permitted to see, and exactly which chapters remain locked away in the dark until every person with a personal stake in the outcome has long since died. This isn't necessarily a story about singular villainy. Institutions of every kind, governments, corporations, universities, even families, tend to develop similar instincts once they've accumulated enough age and enough at stake in their own reputation. What makes the Vatican's case so uniquely striking is simply the scale of the timeline involved. Few other institutions on Earth have the continuous, unbroken authority to sit on a secret, not just for a human lifetime, but for 700 years, and still have that secret land as genuinely newsworthy the moment it finally surfaces. Think about what makes that kind of endurance even possible. Most organizations that might want to bury an inconvenient truth simply don't survive long enough for the strategy to fully pay off. Corporations get acquired, restructured, or dissolved. Governments get overthrown, or at minimum change hands often enough that old secrets eventually find new stewards with less personal incentive to protect them. Even long-lived nations tend to experience revolutions, civil wars, and dramatic reorganizations that scramble access to the historical record. The Vatican has experienced none of that kind of structural rupture in roughly 2,000 years. Popes come and go, typically every decade or two, but the underlying institutional machinery, the archive, the bureaucracy, the carefully maintained rules governing who gets to see what and when, simply continues operating underneath them, largely undisturbed by whichever individual happens to be occupying the papacy at any given moment. That continuity is, in a sense, the entire secret behind the secrecy. It's not that any single person within the Church has been extraordinarily clever at hiding the truth. It's that the institution itself has built a structure durable enough to simply wait out every generation of critics, one at a time, for as long as it takes. As long as the 75-year rule remains firmly in place, and as long as the apostolic penitentiary's doors remain permanently, categorically sealed regardless of how much time passes, there's a fairly chilling conclusion worth sitting with honestly. The darkest secrets connected to this institution aren't safely contained somewhere in the distant past. They are, in a very real and ongoing sense, still being written and quietly filed away today, with the same 75-year clock already ticking on whatever is happening inside those walls in this exact moment. Somewhere in that fortress of shelving right now, an archivist is almost certainly filing away a document connected to a controversy still unfolding in the news today. A document that won't be legally available for anyone outside the Vatican's own walls to examine until long after everyone currently reading about that controversy has grown old, and in many cases, long after they've passed away themselves. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's simply how the system has been built to operate, in plain view, for longer than most nations on Earth have even existed. Hash. If uncovering the history institutions would rather keep buried is exactly the kind of thing you come here for, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting started here at ChronoSphere Academy. Let me know in the comments, which sealed chapter of history do you think deserves to be unlocked first? Until next time, keep questioning the narrative. Welcome to ChronoSphere Academy.